Welcome to the Business Series podcast. My name is Ankush Jain, and I am a state of mind coach working with businesses and individuals. On each episode of this series, I'll be speaking to a coach or trainer on a different topic relevant to your career or personal development. Enjoy. Welcome to another episode of this podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking to Gilly Chater about the importance of EQ in business. Gilly is a member and former president of the Professional Speakers Association New Zealand, and she is a global leadership coach. Welcome, Gilly.
Hello, and it's great to be here, Ankush, across the other side of the world.
I'm really excited to be talking about EQ. I know it's something that probably many of us have heard about. And I guess a really good starting point before we go into the importance of what EQ is in business is, what is EQ?
Oh, look, that's a good question, because when people say EQ, what we're talking about is emotional intelligence. But the Q stands for quotient. It's like, they do a lot of IQ. You've probably heard of IQ and the intelligence quota, or, the intellect, and the tests that people are often given when they're being hired. And in fact, that's one of the things that is a big concern for business today, because the emotional intelligence is, I would say, is not just as important. It's even more important when people get to a leadership position, whether they're a team leader or they're a middle manager or a chief executive, wherever it is. This EQ has been I would call it neglected over the last several years. So IQ, if you think about it, the way the school systems are run, and in the Western world, should I say first, certainly here in New Zealand and in the UK and other parts of the States, we have a huge emphasis on IQ. How clever are we? How clever are we to get the exam results we do? The test has got to be really high, and we're measured on our intelligence, our intellect. And what happens is that people are well equipped and they get to tertiary education or whatever they're going to do. But then when they're suddenly in a leadership role, they're out of balance. So it's not that we weren't born with some emotional intelligence, but it's almost been knocked out of us. And so that's why we have to look today is, how do we help people rebuild the emotional intelligence, the natural emotional intelligence they were born with, and develop that so that they become very good leaders of people rather than managers. And the distinction I make is that the managing side of a job is all about the tasks and the details and, the number crunching and all the how-tos and processes. Whereas EQ is all about having the vision, the big picture, the ability to communicate, get people on board, to inspire, but also to feel inspired yourself, because if we're not motivated and inspired ourselves, how we can do that for others. So what I call the leading side of our role in life is all about the EQ. And so they're just as important. I call it like a leadership umbrella of self-leadership. So whether you actually have people reporting to you or not in a role in business, we need both. And we need it both in our personal lives too.
I remember reading many years ago, there's a book that I'm sure some other people have heard of and probably many have read. It was the first, I guess, personal development book that I ever read, which was called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And his book, I think, was written in the 1920s, so nearly 100 years old now. But in that book, I believe there was a section which talked about this very thing, although it wasn't called, the emotional quotient. But I think it was the example that even in those days, even 100 years ago, that Dale Carnegie was talking about engineers, and he gave the example of engineers. The ones that really got promoted and did well weren't necessarily the ones that were the most intelligent or the best engineers, but they were the ones that had the ability to communicate, influence, motivate others, and maybe explain the the engineering speak, if you like, to other parts of the organization. And so this probably isn't a new concept, but like you say, it might have been ignored. And I think the thing for me, certainly when I was going through my early career, that I didn't really understand was, what can I do about it? I mean, in theory, it sounds great that, and we might call these softer skills, to have them. And I'm sure everyone has had experiences where they've worked for leaders who are very inspirational and have great people skills. And we've probably all worked for leaders that are at the other end of the spectrum. But how does one develop these skills?
Well, I would say that I think, evolve, because I feel that, if you look at young little children, they actually have a natural emotional intelligence, and gets knocked out of them at school because they're channeled in certain directions. But we've had this huge emphasis on, and if I think of business particularly, they want explanation, they want data, they want proof that somebody comes up with a great new idea that it's going to work. So I'd like to talk a little bit about intuition versus intellect, because that's what we're talking about here. And so we were all born with an innate ability to be intuitive. And we talk about trusting our gut feel. And I'll just, you talked about Dale Carnegie, and my favorite, it's aspired to be from Albert Einstein, which again was several years ago. Now, he talked about the intuitive mind is a sacred gift. It's a gift that we have as a human race. The rational mind, the analytical mind, is a faithful servant. But what we've done is we've created a society that honors the analytical, the analytical mind, the servant, and has forgotten the gift of intuition. And intuition is a very important component of EQ. I actually use, sometimes a client would like to use some form of measuring system. I don't need it to work with my clients, but they want a measuring system. And I happen to use a really good one I've used for years called the SE Systems EQ assessment. So it's not a test, it's just an assessment. And I've actually had clients who want me to use it on their whole sales teams, because it helps them to see, because it's very much a people relationship, their job. And what comes out is, quite often, is that some of the cleverest people are very low when they score themselves on creativity and intuition. And we all know. In fact, I read an article just last night about today, the most important part of business is creativity and innovation. We've got to keep going. But if we're stymied by having to analyze everything and overthink everything and then perhaps not come up with the best outcome, we're not relying on that wonderful thing called what I call innate wisdom, the intuitive side of us that sort of knows without knowing and trusting that gut feel. And what has happened is, I'm coaching a 14-year-old at the moment, unusual for me, but she's got a brilliant mind, wants to go to Oxford in England, could do easily. But, she jumps into the intellect all the time, is all over the place. And the reason I'm coaching her is that she's not grounded. And we have that in the same in business. We have people who are so busy trying to prove something that prevents them from new original thought. And that's what we're talking about here. And we get that from having insights, those aha, incredible realization moments. Oh my goodness, how come we didn't think about this before? And we didn't think about this before, so we're caught up with our analytical thinking. So it's not that some people can be creative and innovative, because I often have people say, I'm not a creative person. And by the time they've been through the coaching with me, they say, I didn't realize. So they sort of felt that's not where they fitted into the scheme of things. But you look at little boys and little girls when they're very small, they're incredibly creative. And somebody says, oh no, you can't draw it like that. You've got to draw something else. So what I'm coming back to is that business, even more important today, is that we have that trust in our intuitive side and we're willing to go to that place. I'm a great reader of people who I think sort of challenge our thinking. There's a man called Peter Senge, and he wrote The Fifth Discipline. He's a well-known leadership guru. He also has written a book called Presence with some other authors. And if you really want to explore something interesting, and it totally relates to what we're talking about here, when organizations are wanting to go through change, and Senge talks about the U bend, we go right down the bottom and up the other side. But what happens is organizations get too frightened to go into that space of, I don't know what the answer is. Because we're paid to have the answer. So we're afraid to be in that space of, actually, I don't know what the answer is right now, but I know we have the capacity, if we don't overthink things, to come up with something new, original thought. And he calls that presence, and hence the book is called Presence. It's about being in that state of presence, of totally being in the moment and not worrying about what we already know.
Yeah, I've not heard anyone speak previously about, and I'm not an expert on EQ by any stretch of the imagination, but I've never heard someone talk about EQ being the same as presence and the same as intuition and about creativity. My assumption was EQ was more to do with motivation and influencing. So could you talk about the link there?
Yes, well, it is about, of course it is, because, and it's about listening, it's about all those things. And as I said, I use the SA systems system for some clients. I don't need it, but they have 20 components. Now, I don't need to tell all of them to you, but and of course it is about influence and personal power, but it's emotional self-awareness and emotional self-awareness of others. But these other ones are about compassion, they're about intuition, they're about creativity, they're about relationships. All those things are 20. And anybody can go online, by the way, and have a look at SA Systems. I happen to use this one. I've never met her, but the founder who died last year, Esther O'Reilly, she's been around, and her team are still there. They're a very personal organization. Anybody can go online and do the EQ assessment. Remember, it's an assessment, it's not a test, because we can develop or redevelop ourselves and reconnect with who we really are in that. So it's a great grounding tool for people, and it has 4 quadrants. And obviously we want to be in the higher level than the lower level, and we can go up and down in life as well. That's the point, because how do we handle ourselves when we go down in those dips because something happens and we're not handling life very well, whether it be our health or we lose a job or whatever it is. But those sides, it's a much bigger thing than I think that people understand about the emotional intelligence. And if you think about school systems today, the social and emotional intelligence, there isn't enough balance. I had a client a couple of years ago, and he, of course, understood all this for himself. And he had a very bright son. And this guy is a finance and IT. He's an IT guy. So very much in that intellectual space. But he realized through his own coaching that his son, who's a bright boy, who the school wanted to put up 2 classes in maths, hadn't developed socially, and he didn't want him to be with, when he was only 8, with 10-year-olds. There's a big gap between an 8-year-old boy and a 10-year-old boy, and he didn't want him put into those classes. And he had his own insight, his own realization that he's got plenty of time to do the maths. If he's that clever anyway, I need to grow him and a balanced young boy. And it was really interesting because he was the sort of person that would never have even thought about it until he had an understanding of the importance of EQ. Not just for himself as a leader of the IT team, but also for his own kids. So it is a holistic, I think it's a much more holistic thing than a narrow channel.
Do you have an example of a leader that you've worked with where you've helped them to develop their EQ? And could you tell us a little bit about the work that you did and the outcomes of that work? So that we might take something away from that for ourselves today.
Right. Well, I probably don't work the same as a lot of what I call leadership coaches around the world. because I have a particular way of talking with people, and perhaps because I've done it for over 25 years and I've experienced a lot of things. But I think the whole thing, if somebody wants to change, let's talk about change right now. As things are not working quite well, particularly for a leader in business, and they want to change, it's very difficult. We tend to put in sort of processes and action steps to help them change whatever behaviors they have in certain situations. And of course, about emotional intelligence is about being far more self-aware of when those challenges come up and how they handle themselves. And most people are in that automatic, we all are in that automatic reactive mode. So I help them to see that. But what actually creates the change for them? And I'm coming back to what I talked about a little bit earlier, is about the power of insight. Because insight is absolutely the catalyst for change. So it's having insights is the ability to create. It's the source of lasting change. When somebody, sometimes you meet people and they say, "Oh, I smoked for years and I could never give up, and I went through all these, these programs, and I did this and then that, and then suddenly I had an insight and something changed for me, and I never touched another cigarette." And sometimes we don't attribute what happened because we don't realize what's going on. So again, it's about self-awareness in that moment. We talk about having those, I call it those out of the blue revelations in life. And they might seem very small at the time, but as a result, things dramatically can change. So if somebody has, and what prevents us from having insights is our analytical thinking. Our analytical thing, we're always thinking about, we're always trying to analyze our way through to get a result. If we do this, we can do that. If I see that, I don't do that. So if somebody wants to be, have a higher, I don't like to say level, but an overall higher way of being of emotional intelligence, the change is going to be through an insight moment. And so I'll give you an example. And actually, it's quite a personal thing. This person was the head of finance and IT in a fairly reasonable size multinational in New Zealand. And I got a call from his MD one day saying, "Look, Jack is on stress leave again. And I really know that you can help him, Gilly. Would you do some coaching with him? He's on stress leave. When he comes back, would you do some coaching with him?" So I said, yes, but no. No, I won't wait till he comes back. I'd like to meet with him now. And so he said, okay, that's fine. So he came to my house, actually, because he was on stress leave. And we had one session. And he was with me for a couple of hours. And then the next time he came back. And in that second session, he was very excited. Because the advantage of being on stress leave, he could spend more time with his little 5-year-old daughter. And so he said, every day I was struggling. He's trying to come up with things and think about what can I do with her after school when I pick her up every day? What can I do? And then it suddenly, in a flash, occurred to him, I could ask her. And so he did. He asked her, what do you think? Well, that's normal. Why wouldn't you do that? But it's what she said that was his light bulb moment, that absolute moment of insight. And she said to him, can we just go to the beach and be together today, Daddy? So it wasn't about they had to do anything. They're just being together. And he felt that his whole life he had to do something. He forgot that actually before you do, you need to be in a certain place. And he went down and had that walk along the beach. And it just was in that moment, it was so life-changing for him because he'd always been out in the future worrying about this. He'd always been out in the past and did we do this and did we do that right? And of course, as a finance person, as you said, like engineers, highly analytical. But the thing about that is, and this is several years ago now, and he and I still talk, and he's in another role somewhere else, he actually said to me, because I wrote an article about it and in my sort of newsletter, and you know what he said? I have showed that article to my daughter now she's older. It was such a life-changing moment. He had an insight. And that is absolutely core to change.
Thanks, Gilly. That was a really great story. And I know we've got limited time today, so we've kind of just get the highlights. But what's the one takeaway you would like listeners to take from this conversation today?
I think really being open and exploring the emotional intelligence. It doesn't matter how clever you are. You need that, particularly if you want to be a leader in life. And I just encourage people to, pick up a book, read about it, go on Google, just see what's around, and just see what resources there are to see that it really is important. And their life will be far more in balance. All of our lives are far more in balance when we have much better self-awareness.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time today. If someone's interested to speak with you further or get in contact with you, how might they do that?
Well, very, very easily. My name is Gilly Chater, and my email address is gilly@gillychater.com. And my name's spelled GILLYCHATER. And if you Google me, I usually come up number one because there is no other Gilly Chater in the world yet that has a website called gillychater.com. And you can just go on my contact page and contact me. And of course, I talk to people anywhere in the world who are on Zoom or Skype. So that's probably the best way.
Well, thanks again so much for talking to us about EQ. And I certainly learned a lot from that today. And I will be back next time with another guest, and we'll be talking about another subject that is relevant to business. Until then. Thanks for listening to the Business Series podcast. If you want to hear more, you can click on the subscribe button below. You can share this with someone else who can benefit, or you can like it and encourage others to listen. Also, it would be great if you left a comment below, as I love hearing from listeners and I want to keep creating great content for you. Thanks for listening.